In this tutorial, I'm gonna teach you how to make this grungy, gritty, visceral style in After Effects almost completely procedurally. We'll use all kinds of effects to create completely unique textures and use those textures to distress the look of our layers and even create a custom blur map. There's a whole lot to cover. I'm excited to jump in, so open up After Effects and let's get started. Let's start by making a new comp, and I'm gonna call this grungy title 1920 by 1080. I'll work at 30 frames per second and the duration 10 seconds should be long enough. Click OK, we've got our comp. Let's start by making that red background. So I'm going to use Void, which is a shape layer alternative to solid layers in After Effects. I've remapped the keyboard shortcuts to be the same, so Control Y brings this up for me and it lets me choose the color right away. So I'm just gonna choose that deep dark red color and click OK. You can get Void for free at battleaxe.co/void. It's something that I use all the time for not just solid layers, but also adjustment layers and null objects. And there's just so many features of Void. It seriously shows up in every single composition that I create. Let's rename this background layer BG for background, and I'll go ahead and just lock it, and then let's add in our text. So I'm going to type out Fractal Noise, and this is remembering the last time that I created it. The font I'm using, it's B4, it's really big and pure black. I'm going to align it to the center of my composition, duplicate it with Controller Command D, and we'll type out generator. And I just wanna make sure that this is as wide as the first line, so right about there, maybe a little less, and just space this out a bit. Now, I wanna scale all of this down uniformly, so I'm gonna use Void for another great feature, which is creating a parent controller for both of these layers. Whatever you have selected, when you click on Void, it's gonna generate that Void layer and parent both layers to it, and now I can scale that down and reposition this however I want. I'll make sure that's still aligned to the center, and I'll call this Text Controller. All right, we've got our text laid out, our colors. We're ready to add a lot of grit and grunge to really dirty this up and make it feel a lot less digital. But very quickly, if you wanna have a really solid foundation in After Effects and start to learn how you can come up with your own styles that I'm gonna be teaching you in this tutorial, then check out Launch into After Effects. It's the most comprehensive intro to After Effects ever, where you'll create your first 10 motion design projects, each teaching you a different aspect of the software. It'll kickstart your motion design career and give you the confidence you need to make amazing stuff inside of After Effects. Check the link down in the description to learn more about Launch into After Effects, and I hope to see you inside. All right, the first thing we need to do is punch some really gritty texture through this text so it looks a lot less digital. And to do that, we're going to use the Fractal Noise effect. So Fractal Noise Generator is a script that I made. It's free. You can download it on my website. Again, there's a link down in the description, but this is what I originally used to generate all of the textures in this title graphic. And I actually made it for creating displacement maps for CC Ball Action. If you haven't seen that, definitely go check it out. There's some amazing uses of Fractal Noise in that tutorial. But for this tutorial, we're going to use it just to apply texture to our composition. The way that this script works is you just click randomize and it generates a solid layer with the Fractal Noise effect applied, and every time you click this button, it's going to generate random textures. Sometimes it'll be pure white or pure black. There are ways to get around that, but the point is it's going to generate a random texture every single time you click it. Now, instead of starting from scratch and just clicking randomize a whole bunch of times, I'm going to just give you the values for the Fractal Noise effect to recreate this title exactly as I ended up with. So I'm going to be looking off screen to read the values a lot through this tutorial, just so you know. But let's start by making a solid the size of our composition. It doesn't matter what color it is, and we'll call this Text Texture Matte and apply the Fractal Noise effect to it. All right, the first thing we need to change is the fractal type to being dynamic progressive, the noise type to linear, and then our contrast, we're gonna blow this out, 1128 and brightness 282. Then we'll go into the transform controls and increase the scale to 262. We'll go to the complexity and crank that all the way up to its max of 20. And then in the sub settings, we're gonna change the sub influence up to 100, subscaling down to 22, and that's it for our first texture. Now the way that we're going to use this is as a Luma Matte for the text layer. So I'm gonna grab both of those, and then I'll grab the Track Matte Pick Whip and select that texture matte, which is automatically going to disable the visibility, but it's using it as an alpha matte by default. That's what this icon means. And that's just taking the alpha, which is just a solid layer here, none of the color data, just the alpha channel, and applying it to this text layer. So it's not making any difference. What I wanna do is click on that icon to switch it to being a Luma Matte, which we can tell with this little sun icon. And now it's going to take the brightness brightness values of the source layer and remap them to opacity values. So the black texture from this layer, 100% black pixels will become 100% transparent, and 100% white pixels stay 100% opaque. Everything in between is a different level of transparency. And if I turn off my background, we can see, sure enough, this actually is carving the alpha channel into those text layers using the brightness values of our source texture. So that's doing exactly what we need it to. That's our first layer of grunge. But the edges of our text are still extremely clean and crisp. So how do we grunge those up? We're going to use the Roughen Edges effect. So let's search for that and apply it to that first text layer. And that's just going to roughen up the alpha channel of the layer, not the actual contents. You can't really tell since this is pure black, but it's only affecting the alpha channel, not the color channels of the layer. And it's actually using Fractal Noise to do that. So let's modify these properties a little bit. Border, I'm going to turn down to 6.7. Edge sharpness will go up to 6.1. The scale will go down to 81. And that gives us that really crunchy, crisp edge. Now, depending on what you're creating, you might want to make that softer by lowering the edge sharpness. But for this specific look, I want it to be very crunchy, very gritty. So I'm okay with that kind of aliased edge. Now I want to apply that same Roughen Edges effect to the generator text, but instead of just copying and pasting, I'm going to copy it with property links. The keyboard shortcut is Control-Alt-C or Command-Option-C on a Mac, and what this is going to do when I paste it on the other layer is link up all of the properties of that effect with expressions to the original instance of that effect, meaning I can zoom in here and change the controls on the Fractal Noise text layer. So let's say increase the border, and that's also going to affect the instance that I pasted on generator. So if I ever want to change this, I can do it in one place instead of two places. I use copy with property links all the time. I even made an AE Genius video covering that feature, so go check that out if you haven't seen it yet. All right, so we've got texture carving out an alpha channel, we've got roughened edges, but our text is still very nice and aligned, and I'd like to make that a little less uniform. So to do that, I'm going to make a new adjustment layer, or a variant in the case of void, and I'll just call this Turbulent Displace, because that's exactly what we're going to apply to it. So let's search for that effect, Turbulent Displace, and modify this a little bit. That's obviously a little too warpy. I'm gonna turn the amount down to 6, increase the size up to 132, and that's really all I need to do. Now that's just gonna give it a little more of an organic feel. It's not quite so digital. All right, so we did a really good job of grunging this text up and making it feel less digital, but I want to add in a little bit of motion because this is all completely static at this point. So why don't we start with just offsetting the text a little bit to make it look like it's dancing every so often and not just a still image. So to do this, we're going to use a text animator. So I'm going to go into this layer and I'm going to go to the animate menu and I'm going to add a position value. That's automatically going to give me an animator with a range selector and that position property I just added. And inside that animator, we now have this add drop-down menu. In that, I'm going to go into the properties and I'm going to add a rotation. This might be going off the screen recording here, but add property rotation. Between position and rotation, we can give a lot of random movement to this text. Now, range selectors are really meant for when you want to do very clean, linear types of motion. You can do randomization in there, but it's not really meant for offsetting things in a very sporadic way. So I'm going to actually get rid of the range selector and go back to the add menu, and this time go to the selector section and choose wiggly. A wiggly selector is going to take whatever values we put in these properties and wiggle them around. Let me show you exactly what I mean. If I increase the Y position and I press the space bar, now my text on that text layer is going to move up and down, wiggling by a value of 18 pixels in either direction. But that's a lot smoother than what I'm after. I don't want it to be a smooth motion at all. I want it to be very sporadic. So I'm actually gonna go into my wiggly selector and change some properties. First of all, the wiggles per second. I'm gonna turn it all the way off. So it's not wiggling at all. It's just offsetting everything by that position value. If I turn this off and back on, you can see it is moving those text layers around. They're just not animating. What I actually want is this random seed value, because every time this value changes, we basically get a different starting point for the randomization of these values that we have down here. And to produce this kind of emotion, I basically just want to generate a random value on this random seed property every frame of the comp. So to do that, I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and click on the stopwatch. And then I'm going to type a simple expression, random, which again, I have a tutorial covering this expression above, but you just saw me type out random. It auto-filled for me. I just pressed Enter to fill that out, and it puts my cursor right between the parentheses. I need to put either 1 or 2 values in between these parentheses. If I put in one value, so let's just say a really big number, 10,000, then it's going to generate a random value between 0 and 10,000 every frame of the composition. It'll be completely random. If I were to put another number in this, so let's say 20, 10,000, then it's going to generate a random value between those two numbers. So by default, with one number, it'll generate between 0 and whatever you type in. With two numbers, it's going to be between those two numbers. I don't really care since this is just going to generate random values. So I'm going to say random 10,000 and finish it with a semicolon and play this back to see what we got. All right, now that text is really bouncing around, and it honestly doesn't look that great. I don't want it to update absolutely every frame. Instead, I want it to happen at a rate of 5 frames per second. So I'm going to go back into editing this expression, drop that down a line, and on the first line, I'm going to type in posterize time. Again, I'll just autofill, very easy. And in between these parentheses, we just need to put the frame rate that we want this expression to be evaluated at. So in my case, 5 frames per second. Finish that with a semicolon, click off, and now we're going to get a random value at a rate of 5 frames per second. And that's just a little bit easier to look at. That's the look that I'm going for, but it's moving probably more than I need it to. I want this to be pretty subtle, so I'm gonna turn this position on the Y-axis down to 3, and now it's just barely moving around, and I think that subtlety is what I actually want. I don't really think I need any X-axis values, but you could put that in just as easily. If you wanna go for more random movement, absolutely play around with that. You can do whatever you want, and this wiggly selector is going to randomly offset it based on the random seed value that we just set up with that expression. All right, I'm going to turn that back down to 0, but I do want to increase the rotation a little bit. If I put it up to 5, that's pretty dramatic. I don't think I need to be rotating my text quite that much, but I'm also noticing the text is all rotating off of this anchor at the base of the text, essentially. So I want to change that anchor value. In fact, you can even see it right here with the text layer selected. These tiny X's, those are the anchor points for each individual character. So I need to go up to the More Options section of my text layer and go to the Grouping Alignment property, and the second value right here, the Y anchor point, essentially, raise that up to about the center of the layer, and now the rotation will happen in the center of the text instead of the base. It's just a little too extreme. So I'm going to come back down to that rotation value and probably just rotate it a single degree, and even that is still noticeable. So that looks pretty good now. It's subtle again, and I can transfer that over to the other text layer as easily as just selecting Animator 1 and then controller command clicking on Grouping Alignment, and then I'll copy those with property links, Control-Alt-C or Command-Option-C, and then paste them onto generator. And now those will be linked to this original text layer as well, and we've got that same little random offset motion. Now that our text is moving around, let's have the texture within it move around as well. So we need to go back to our text texture mat and find the random seed property for this fractal noise effect. So in the evolution options, there's the random seed value. I just double clicked on it to expose it down here. And with that selected, I'm going to double tap the S key, so that's the only property I see. And then I'll click on one of these text layers and double tap the E key to bring up the expressions for that layer. And this is the same exact expression that I want to apply to this random seed. So I'm going to right click on this, say copy expression only. Let me make this a little bigger. Right click, copy expression only, and then paste that onto the random seed value of the fractal noise effect. And now that's just going to give me a random texture at a rate of 5 frames per second, just like the offset position that we have on the text. So now that that's animating, our texture is going to be animating, carving out that alpha channel. Okay, moving right along, let's add some texture to our background now, because it's still just a solid red color. And for this, I used a texture from texturelabs.org, my favorite place to get textures on the internet. Brady, who runs it, not only creates incredibly high quality textures that are completely free for you to use however you want, but he also makes some of the best Photoshop and After Effects tutorials on the planet. Definitely go check out Texture Labs on YouTube as well. But I searched for newsprint and found these two textures. This is the one that I went with, Paper 305, an old newsprint paper, and I used the large version, which is 4K. It's absolutely fantastic. and just brought it into After Effects and dropped it right in front of the background. Now, I don't want this color to influence the colors of my comp, so I'm going to just add the tint effect. And the way that I animated this is using Texture Looper, which is a script that I actually created for After Effects. All you have to do is select any number of texture layers, in this case just one, and click Loop Selected Textures, and it's going to immediately be animated randomly on both the position and the rotation with a really easy set of controls for how fast it updates, how random the movement is, and even being able to do things like mirror the edges, which I do want to do to get rid of that seam. I want to match this frame rate to the posterization that we added to the expressions on our other layers, so I'm going to drop that down to 5 frames per second. Now we've got some random rotation. I'm going to scale this down since it's a very large texture. We have a lot of resolution to work with, and I like the way that that texture looks at that scale. And then I'm going to move straight to the levels effect that Texture Looper automatically applied and just crush the contrast a little bit, make this a little bit grittier, and then change the blend mode of this layer to overlay so that it blends in with the rest of our scene. So if I unsolo this, we can see that is now being applied to our entire composition. I can play this back and we've got that really great texture from Texture Labs. Now it looks like I need to scale it up just a little bit so we're not seeing those edges. And I think my red is a little too intense, so I'm gonna grab that color right there and just back off the opacity and maybe the darkness a little bit. Something like that feels a little bit easier on the eyes. Okay, now you don't have to have Texture Looper to create this texture, but I just wanted to demo it for you so that you can see just how quick and easy it is to create random textures using it. But I'll go ahead and show you right now how you can do this without Texture Looper in case you don't have $10 or you don't want to spend that money. So I'm gonna bring this texture out, again, right in the same place. We'll add that tint effect, change the blend mode to overlay, and scale it down. So it's about the same scale as what we had with Texture Looper. I'm going to add the motion tile effect right here, and this tile center property is going to let us shift things around. I want to mirror the edges so we don't see that seam nearly as much, and we need to offset this randomly. So I'm going to Alt Option click on the stopwatch for that expression, and let's type something in here. So we're going to first start with posterized time. We want 5 frames per second. On the second line, we're going to say randomize this position, but because this property is an array of 2 values, we have to write our expression in an array as well. So I'm going to start with an open square bracket, and I'm going to say random, and then I'll just say -2000, 2000. So we get a random value between those 2 numbers. And then outside the parentheses, I'll put a comma for my second value that represents the second value in the array, which I want to do the exact same thing. So I'll just say random -2000, 2000 again, and then finish that all off with a semicolon outside of those square brackets. And that should now randomize the position of that tile center property at a rate of 5 frames per second. Great, that's the first step. The next step is to add the transform effect. So let's grab that. And this will be our rotation. So I'm going to grab the rotation property, Alt or Option click on that, and essentially write the same expression. So I'm actually just going to copy this and I'm going to paste it in here. The difference is we don't need an array this time because this value is not an array. It's just a single value. So I'm going to get rid of all of this, and random rotation, we're gonna go -360 degrees, +360 degrees, any value in between there will be great. And now that's going to randomly rotate. Now we can see the edges of that texture, so I need to go to Motion Tile and expand the output width and height, but not a lot. This is a 4K texture. If I go crazy with this, After Effects could crash, so I'm just going to increase the height until we can't see those edges, about 150, and we'll say width 120, and that should take care of those edges. All right, that looks pretty good. We just need to crush that contrast with the levels effect. I'll bring that out and again do the same kind of thing. Bring the black and white points in and just move that gamma slider over a little bit. And then I just want to lower the opacity down to say 35% so it's not quite as intense there. And that actually did make that red background a lot darker since that texture isn't as intense. So I'm just going to brighten that up a little bit. Okay, so now we've got our paper texture. I'll just rename it really quickly to Newsprint Grunge, and that's how you randomly animate a texture. Like I said, Texture Looper just makes it as easy as a click of a button. Check that out in the description if you're interested. Now, what about that blur that the original title graphic had? That is one of my favorite things about this animation, and it's using the compound blur effect. So let's just apply it to the same adjustment layer we have right here that I called Turbulent Displace. I'm gonna rename this Effects. And on this Effects layer, I'm going to add the Compound Blur Effect. And the way that this effect works is by taking brightness values and applying them to a blur. Just like we're using this text texture matte to carve out the alpha channel of these text layers. Instead of affecting the alpha channel, we're going to affect the blurriness. So by default, it's going to choose itself as the source layer. We need to create a blur layer for this compound blur. So let's make another new solid and apply the Fractal Noise effect to it. Again, I used Fractal Noise Generator for all of the Fractal Noise textures in the original title, but I'm just gonna give you the values here. The fractal type is going to be set to terrain. Noise type is going to be set to spline. Contrast down to 76, and the brightness to -65. Under transform, we're going to change the rotation to -327 and the scale up to 959. We'll go into the complexity and increase that up to 8.6 and go into the sub settings, change the sub influence to 75, the sub scaling to 47, and the sub rotation to 156. And that is a pretty cool looking fractal noise texture. All right, we're going to rename this blur map, and we're going to just disable the visibility. Again, we don't need to see it, it just needs to be in our comp, so I'm gonna move it down to the bottom. And then on the compound blur effect, we're going to choose that as our blur layer. So I'm gonna choose blur map, and I need to make sure to say effects and masks, not just the source, so that it takes that fractal noise effect into account when it's applying the blur. And there you go. If we take a closer look, you can see that portions are being blurred and portions are staying nice and crisp. It's directly related to the blur map. So the dark pixels are staying clear, the brighter pixels are getting more blurred, and we can control how blurry it gets with this maximum blur value. So I'm gonna turn that down to a value of 8, just so it's not quite as intense. And we have some transparent pixels around the outside of the comp. I'm not worried about that because of some other effects we're going to apply in a little bit, and you really hardly notice it. But if you ever needed to fill in that opacity, just add the solid composite effect after the compound blur and choose the same color as your background, which in this case is this red color. I'll just put that right into this eyedropper, and that's gonna fill any transparent pixels in that background. But like I said, I'm not worried about it because we're going to apply some other effects that will make that less noticeable. But let's go ahead and animate our blur map in the same way that we did our text texture map. So I'm going to, again, copy just the expression of that random seed value, and I'm going to search for random seed on this layer and paste it. Now that's gonna be randomly animating just like everything else. And if we play this back, that blur is now going to be randomized. So that looks great. Now I'm noticing on a few frames, our newsprint texture is not filling out completely. So I'm just going to scale that up a little bit so that we don't see those flat edges. All right, now onto those effects I was talking about. Let's go to our effects adjustment layer. And this is a whole stack of effects, which every single effect that I ever use has a tutorial dedicated to it in the Effects of After Effects series. You can literally search for any effect name on my channel, and I have a tutorial explaining exactly how it works. So I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly, just reading values and not explaining much about the effects themselves, just so we can get to the end result. We're gonna start by making the edges of everything a little less crisp by adding a Gaussian blur, and that will go before the compound blur effect. And we're just gonna blur this out a little bit, just about 2.5. So it's just giving a soft little blur to everything. And you can look right here to kind of see what exactly it's doing. The compound blur isn't affecting that section. So we're just giving a little bit of softness overall to our entire composition. And then we're going to sharpen it back up using the unsharp mask effect right after the Gaussian blur. And I'm gonna turn the amount down to 40 and the radius up to 4, and that just gives a little bit of a crunchy contrast. This is without and with. Again, it just is to give it a less digital feel. Next, I'm going to duplicate that unsharp mask, and we're going to change the values to 60 and 180 on the radius. And that's gonna make everything a lot crunchier and even more saturated. But that's overall kind of just blending all of these brightness values together in an interesting way and creating a very stylized look. Next, I want to lighten up the darks a little bit with a curves effect. We're going to put that right after the second unsharp mask. And what I'm going to do is just lift the blacks a little bit, not a ton, but I basically want to make those blacks not pure black. I want them to be a dark gray, but I don't want to lose a ton of contrast. So I'm going to add another point right here and bring it back down a little bit. This can be very subtle, but I'm just trying to kind of fade my image a little bit and not make it quite so contrasted. Then I want to add a layer of noise, so we're not getting any kind of splotchy, smoothed out sections. So I'm going to add a noise effect right after the curves and increase that value again to a small number. Just 8 is going to be fine, and that's going to add a little bit of noise to the entire composition. And actually I was wrong. I don't want it after curves, I want it after compound blur so that the compound blur doesn't get rid of that noise where that matte is. So we've just got that little bit of grain overlaid the entire composition now. And then finally, I want to give the entire composition a little bit of lens distortion with the optics compensation effect, again at the end of the effect stack. And I'm going to reverse the lens distortion and increase the field of view. If I do this a lot, you can see exactly what's happening here. This is a really fun effect to animate, but I'm going to make it a little bit more subtle, maybe around 18, 19, 20, somewhere in there, just to give it a little bit of lens distortion. And that's the effect I was talking about that's going to push out those edges so we don't see that opacity anymore. So I'm just going to increase that a little bit more. I'm still seeing a little bit at the top, so why don't I take my own advice? I'll add the solid composite effect at the very end of this effect stack, and we'll grab that same red color. So let me get that background color right here, copy the hex code, and paste it into that solid composite just to cover my bases. Now I know for sure there's no transparent pixels in the background there. And then finally, I just want to add a vignette around the entire composition, and I want to make this pretty organic. So I'm going to make a new adjustment layer and apply the curves effect to it. And I'm going to change the blend mode to luminosity. That's further down in the list here, but luminosity is going to only affect brightness values, not color values. So no matter how much contrast I give this layer now, it's not going to affect that red. If I change this back to normal, look at how much it's oversaturated that image. So that's the difference between normal and luminosity. What I want to do is just make everything darker and then draw a mask around this layer. Now, because I used void to make this vignette, let me name this vignette. Switching to the pen tool is going to draw shapes instead of masks, unless I tell After Effects draw a mask. So I'm going to make sure I check that on, and then I can click and drag to make an organic looking vignette shape, and then press F to bring up the feather and crank this up really high, and then switch the mask from adding to subtracting. And now we've got this very organic vignette that I can mess around with as much as I want to look exactly the way that I want it to. So that's without and with. That might be a little extreme, but obviously this is something you can adjust to your own taste. But those are the finishing effects that I applied to the entire title. And here it is all in motion. It's obviously come a lot further than where we started. All that's left is animating the text on screen. And to do that, I used Type Jazz, another one of my tools that I created for making very complex text animations extremely easy to do. And I'm gonna give you a demo of how that works right now. And I'm just gonna solo these text layers to make it render a little bit more quickly without all of those other finishing effects. So let's start with the Fractal Noise layer. I'm going to click the Type Jazz button, and that's going to immediately animate this text on the Y position with this kind of overshooting animation. But that's not the type of animation I'm after, so I'm gonna go straight into Type Jazz and modify the animation in Control. So let's go to the animation controls first, and I'm gonna change the animation type from oscillate to linear. So now it's just going to animate in linearly from left to right. That's what it's set up to do. And I wanna change the easing value. So the ease high, I'm going to really crank up all the way to 100, and the ease low, I'm gonna turn down to a negative number. And now that's gonna come in a lot more dramatically. Okay, so the easing looks good. It's animating in the direction I want, but the actual motion of that animation isn't what I want. So let's close up the animation controls, go into our transform controls, and take that Y position off of the animation. So nothing is happening right now. And what I want to do is grab the Y value for the grouping alignment. This is the same grouping alignment that we adjusted for randomly rotating that text around the center point of the layer. And you'll notice that Type Jazz is stacking with that animator. It's still preserving all of that wiggliness, even though we have a complex text rig set up in addition. So I'm just gonna continue moving that grouping alignment down really far, and then I'll go down to my Z rotation or my 2D rotation value and change that. And now you can see that this is rotating off of an anchor point much further down on the layer. So I'm just gonna move this around until I find an anchor point that I like and play this back. And now the text is coming in, rotating into place off of that anchor point. That's exactly what I wanted. I'm gonna press U to show that there are animation out keyframes as well, and a whole section of type jazz for controlling that animation out, but I don't want the text to animate out. I'm just animating this title on, so I'm gonna get rid of those keyframes for now. And I can very easily transfer this over to the other layer by using the copy function right here. Select my other text layer, go to the same place and time and paste that type jazz. And that will now transfer all of those properties that I changed for type jazz on the first layer to the second layer. The only thing is I want this to animate from the opposite direction. So let's go into the animation in animation controls, and we're gonna change the direction from left to right to left, and it'll come in the opposite direction. I just also want it to rotate from the opposite direction. So I'll go into transform controls, invert this rotation value to -9. And now those two text layers are coming in opposite directions. The only other thing I might do to this is drop down the frame rate of that text animation using the posterize time effect. So let me grab the Fractal Noise layer and I'll type out posterize time. And this does the exact same thing as our expression, but to the entire layer. So you put in whatever frame rate you want this layer to animate at, and that's what it will do. So if I drop this down to 5, now my type jazz animation is going to be at a frame rate of 5 frames per second. You can see the difference between the top line and the bottom line. The only issue is you can't really see that animation at a rate of 5 frames per second. So I think I'm gonna increase this up to a value of 15 frames per second. And now we're gonna be able to see that happen a little bit better, but it still kind of fits that low frame rate feel that we have for the rest of our composition. So I'm just gonna copy and paste that over to the second text layer. And now if I unsolo these layers and play everything back, we've got an extremely visceral, super gritty, amazing looking textured style to our entire composition, complete with that awesome blur. All of this stuff is completely adjustable, and you can apply it to more than just text. Any type of layer that you put in here, whether it's a logo or somebody else's graphic, can have this distressed look and have a very organic feel to it, even though it's completely digital here in After Effects. I really hope that you learned a lot in this tutorial and that you saw that you don't need external tools to create really cool stuff in After Effects, but they certainly can help speed up the process. Texture Looper, Type Jazz, Fractal Noise Generator, Void, these are all tools that I use all the time in After Effects, so definitely check them out, especially Fractal Noise Generator and Void. They're free. There's no reason you couldn't add them to your workspace right now, but there's links to all of it down in the description. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.
It was fun.